Welcome to the Schmooze, Calgary's weekly community podcast where we bring together the voices, events, and stories shaping Jewish life in our city. I'm Don Shapiro with Jared Shore. Pull up a chair. Let's schmooze. We just said goodbye to Mike Fegelman. He is the editor-in-chief of Honest Reporting Canada. And man, the work that they do holding an organization as big as CBC to account in the way they do it with the efficacy that they have was eye-opening about not only what an organization could do if it's got a singular focus and works towards it, but what we can do if we stand up and say, no, that's not right. That's not acceptable anymore. And to see how that actually translates to action and committees and change is
Well,
amazing.
I mean, actually, something that you said, Don, is really interesting because you talked about CBC and a singular focus. Th- Honest reporting is looking at all media bias.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, why do we think that, and why is that your perception? Why does that even come out that way? Is because the CBC, given two things. Number one, its responsibility. It makes it unique
As a
as a
publicly funded
national
one. Yeah.
public
Yeah.
broadcaster, and for how egregious their coverage has been. So those two things almost make it seem like honest reporting is wholeheartedly focused on the CBC. We talk a lot about the CBC in this conversation, but honest reporting is looking at everybody. It just so happens that the CBC has been uniquely terrible in how they have covered this, the bias that is infused into every, I shouldn't say every bit of coverage. CBC produces a ton of content, but objectively, and Honest Reporting just last week came out with a report, which we'll put in the show notes, really important for people to have a peek at. Objectively, the CBC is failing Canadians by not providing uh, coverage that is free of bias. They are providing such ideological coverage of a very complex issue.
And that's I think really what's striking. I mean, one of the points that Mike mentions is this sort of mentality, and it just seems that when there was a shift, whether it be hiring practices or whether it be ideology, um, it's a snowball effect, right? Like when we talk about going down the rabbit hole of something, it seems that that's where we are now. For many of us, we really noticed the effects of this misreporting after October 7th, but it has been going on for a long, long time. There was a part of me that was shocked that Mike started off with them back in '03 because I was like, was it as bad back in '03? And then throughout the discussion, I was like, damn, yeah, it was that bad even back then. Yet we didn't maybe feel the results. It didn't snowball enough into a sort of general mentality across Canada, which now we are feeling much more tangibly.
Well, I think the bias, we asked Mike about it. I think the bias was a little bit more subtle, frankly,
Right.
back then. And I think it is so obvious, so egregious, that it is simply hard to ignore. So yeah, it's existed for a long time. It's gotten substantially worse.
Yeah, I mean, 20 years ago they would call Hamas a terror organization, and today they refuse to do so. So it's even though it's prescribed as one, it's an insane bit, but in terms of the reality of what others are doing, but also inspirational in terms of what we can do. We do not have to be passive in this, waiting for something to happen. We can be active, and he points out how we can be active. And when we start taking a look again, the spirit of this podcast, even of disparately we're fingers, together we're a fist, and that's why we started this podcast, being able to speak to people of Mike's caliber, considering the change that they're advocating for on a daily basis. It's amazing.
They've got 80,000 subscribers across Canada. Their goal is 100,000. Uh, Folks, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I filter a ton of people over to Honest Reporting because the numbers are important. Now, we talk about a particular issue that just came up in the CBC, uh, some really biased reporting, as I'll call journalistic malpractice, um, and the Iranian community here in Canada that is seeking freedom for their brothers and sisters in Iran. They saw what terrible bias was brought out of this report. They reacted, CBC corrected it. So, it does go to show you that our voices have power. We have to be engaged. And honest reporting is such a great way to be engaged.
Yeah, and it's I think we're in a situation where, I mean, if we take a look at what's happening in New York, right? They voted in Zoran Mamdani, and that is a huge problem. But we've had that. We had a Mamdani, and her name was Gondik. We have one in Toronto. Her name is Chow. Like we are dealing with these problems right now. This isn't new to us. It's just not being presented as alarming as it is down south. So these situations are alarming. These situations do need coordinated effort and us to stand up and speak out, because when we do, change can happen.
For sure, for sure. Hey, Don, we've talked a lot about events over the last little bit, but I want to remind our listeners that in coming weeks we're going to have Doug Century on, and we talked about Doug a few weeks back. Doug is a
Yep.
fantastic author, and his book about Hanasenesh, Crash of the Heavens. Um, Please read it before Doug comes on. It is one of the best books I've read in a long time. So make sure you get to that before Doug comes on to the show. You'll enjoy Doug that much more when you've been inspired by the story that he's written of Hannah Senesh.
Absolutely. Folks, there's a lot on the go. There's a lot of events. Be sure to check the Jewish Calgary calendar for these events. A lot of them do require registration, but they're easily accessible. Sometimes it's via Zoom, so you can really make it happen or view the recordings. Again, thank you so much for listening in, and I can't wait for you guys to really consider some of Mike's words. So I guess let's just get right into the schmooze.
Israel must take measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to the members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip.
I'm really excited today to have Mike Fegelman. He is the editor-in-chief at Honest Reporting Canada on our podcast today. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Don.
So, how does one go and become editor-in-chief at Honest Reporting Canada? What's your background? Is it it is have some journalism in there? Was that always your aspiration? Tell us a little bit about what it's like growing up in Canada and ending up where you are.
Ooh, well, that's a great story. So I've been at Honest Reporting Canada since 2003. since its very genesis and how I came to the organization. As I say, is it odd or is it God? It was serendipity. I don't know. One of the very first times I was ever in Israel was on the birthright trip, like a lot of Jews growing up. And I was in Jerusalem, a place called Kikar Tzion. It's called Zion Square. And there was a garbage that had a poster inside that said, "Help fight media bias against Israel. Join Honest Reporting." And I was just immediately out after attending Carleton University and journalism school and working for a number of media outlets. And I said, "Look, I have a new passion for Zionism in the state of Israel and supporting the Jewish community, and coupled with my existing professional passion in journalism, can I marry both together?" And I didn't know it at the time, but Honest Reporting in Canada was just looking to start out, and they were looking for a founding director. And I called up and I said, "Hey, what you guys are doing is so important. I'm so intrigued. I'd love to volunteer." A couple days later, I was hired as the executive director. So, as they say, timing, you just can't make this up. And it's been about 22 years of dedicated service, and we kind of regard ourselves as a 22-year startup working to ensure fair and accurate media coverage of Israel.
Amazing.
Mike, how long had Honest Reporting been around before Honest Reporting Canada?
Sure. The international honest reporting had been
Mhm.
around probably for 2 or 3 years, give or take.
Mhm.
It was created at the apex of the first and second Intifada. Largely was started out on a very, very grassroots effort. A bunch of yeshiva students in the United Kingdom who were, like a lot of people, very frustrated at the time with the British media coverage and said, "You know what, we have to do something about this. We can't just pass the buck of responsibility and complain and woe me." And they just started off filing complaints, a small quorum of maybe 5 or 10 people. And then there was this realization that for the media to really listen to a certain constituency, there had to be a large enough size of a bully pulpit and a representational organization that engaged in diplomacy and was pragmatic, that worked constructively with the media, and when necessary, that had a big stick approach when there were uncooperative journalists to put their feet to the fire. So, it eventually became an incorporated nonprofit, and then started monitoring the media from coast to coast and throughout the world.
My distrust of journalism and media goes back to 1991. I can actually remember the date. So my oldest brother, he was serving the IDF, and this is right during the first Gulf War. And as a lone soldier in Israel, he was able to come back to Canada for 1 month vacations, right? Like sort of a military sabbatical, if you will. Come back home, and then you have to go back to the army. Now, a week before he goes back on his first trip, boom, the Gulf War starts. And this is when Iraq was sending Scuds into Israel. And so this was a huge news piece because we were living in Red Deer. So somehow the local newspaper, the Red Deer Advocate, got a hold of us, and they're like, "We want to do an article, small town boy going back to fight the big fight overseas." So they come in and they interview my brother. They interview my parents because my mom flew with them. And then they ask, and I'm 15 at the time, 14, 15, and they asked me some questions about what's happening. And so, I gave some answers. And so then, the journalist, or he kind of takes his pad of paper, folds it up, and he goes, "So, are you worried about anything else?" And I'm like, "Oh, I guess I'm worried about my mom. You know how moms are. They exaggerate everything." That's the quote they used as they applied for me. Don says his mom exaggerates, and I'm like, that is so not what I said. And I guess over the years, what I've realized is when I read an article about something I know about, I'm like, "Oh my God, they're missing this. This is factually incorrect here." It doesn't have to be about Israel. It could be about anything. They've missed this, they missed this. And then I immediately go to the next article about something I don't know about, and I go, "Oh, interesting. I learned a lot." And then I started saying, "Wait a second. If they made mistakes on this, why wouldn't they make mistakes on everything else that's in this newspaper? Why am I trusting it?" And so that's where my, I think, healthy distrust of media came from. And that's the exact thing that I think that you're now trying to combat, hey, Mike?
That's exactly it, Don. And I like how you described it as a healthy distrust because, one thing we try to encourage Canadians to be is to be media literate and to be critical of anything and everything that's being reported. Don't take it as veracity. We live in a world where it has never been more difficult to discern fact from fiction, whether you take into account AI and deep fakes and that whole world where everyone's getting duped and you don't know what's really truthful. Whether it's a geopolitical issue like the Arab-Israeli conflict or something tied to local domestic politics in Calgary or environmental issues or women's rights, whatever it may be, you have to look at it with a skeptical, discerning eye and ask those questions. Is what's being reported fair? Is it accurate? Is it balanced? Is it contextualized? Is there an opinion that's disguised as news? Is what the reporter is doing, is there more advocacy and activism in the writing and in the reportage? Or is there an element of malice? Is it innocuous? Is it ignorance? We try to the best of our ability to judge favorably, give the benefit of the doubt, and the realization that more often than not, journalists are actually open-minded to engage in a constructive dialogue with their readership. That's what we're really trying to encourage. We're trying to not just set the record straight, but try to improve journalism if that's possible.
Right.
Okay, well, Mike, okay, you guys have been in this game for a long time now. Now, most of this media bias has become uh, something more at the fore for the Jewish community over the last couple of years, where it has become so glaringly obvious. But you guys have been in this for a very long time. How has the game changed, or has it? I mean, so I've been a subscriber for almost the entirety of Honest Reporting Canada's lifetime. I think back, I can actually put some timelines to it because I remember having a discussion about Honest Reporting at my stag with a friend, a fun stag, right? Um, uh, but but that puts it at over 20 years ago. How has the landscape changed, and how is Honest Reporting navigating some of these differences?
That's a great question, Jared. The first thing I would say is our goal is to be organizationally obsolete, and that we really we would success for us is in the sense that we shouldn't have to exist.
Yeah.
Sadly, our business is booming, and that's naturally in the past 2 years in the wake of October 7th, a world of misinformation and disinformation, and a realization that the craft of journalism now more than ever there used to be, the traditional objective, politically neutral journalist like a Walter Cronkite. That has rapidly changed. There is a lurch towards activism, almost as if it's a badge of honor, where you're actively favoring one side or the other, and without a goal of actually procuring a broad and equitable marketplace of ideas. Journalists come out of J school present day being effectively told, okay, this is social justice, this is advocating one issue or another, and I'm not just talking about the issues relevant necessarily to the Jewish community and to Israel. This is just how the kind of evolution, or I would almost even argue de-evolution
Mhm.
of journalism. And coupled with that, and as a result of it, what we're seeing is a very drastic erosion of journalistic standards, where you've got journalists who are going on social media on their handles, which are openly identifying that they're an appendage of a credible news organization, who are actively weighing in on an issue to which they are supposed to be politically neutral, right? So the equivalent would be, imagine you had a journalist who was championing, let's say, the Liberal Party over the Conservatives, and then told the next day to report on that issue with an objective lens. You can't do that. I mean, there is a purist craft of journalism. What is reported, you cover it, you repress your opinion, but sadly, it's bled over into their reporting. The challenge is that the consumer of news has never been more misinformed, and it's said that what's reported today becomes foreign and domestic policy tomorrow. So there are serious ramifications on any kind of an issue when the populace doesn't get the facts and gets a skewed narrative that's being fed by the media.
I'm conscious of that Denzel Washington quote, right? If you don't listen to the news, you're uninformed, and if you do listen to it, you're misinformed. Uh, but there was before October 7th, there was a monk debate. Douglas
Murray.
Douglas
Murray.
Murray and Malcolm Gladwell talking about the particular evil in Canada of the CBC, that it is government funded and serves as a mouthpiece. And Douglas Murray really went through a complete destruction of CBC's reporting on the Freedom Convoy, as one example, as well as others. Now, for us, and as Jared alluded, we've really been cognizant of it to the point of activism since October 7th. But before that, there was a reporter for the CBC who was their Middle East correspondent 20 some odd years ago. And every single time I'd see him, I'm like, oh, this guy, like, you're missing this. And you know what he's missing, but I'm just a guy sitting on my couch, reading this or listening to this, and I'm frustrated. But there's nothing I can do about it. I guess, is there? That's the
Well, there is, what I really wanted, well, a couple things. The first is I was at that event with Doug and at the Monkey Day.
nice.
I've witnessed it firsthand, and he's a master orator.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, every power and skill and that my organization has, Jared, you have it. Don, you have it too. We really the very essence of Honest Reporting Canada is to democratize our approach of having watchdogs out there, whether it's in Calgary and Saskatoon and the Maritimes and elsewhere, people who are active media patrollers who read something, read it critically, do a subtle, simple investigation comparing different news sources, different reports about the same issue, and then critiquing it publicly and in dialogue with the journalists. I would say that there isn't, I happen to have 20 years on the job and a lot of skills and knowledge about these kind of issues, but there's no unique proprietary technology that we have. And that's a real benefit and attribute that I think our community can cling on to, which is that everybody has an opportunity to make inroads and, the sense of cliche, to make a difference because fundamentally, as it relates to Israel, it's fighting the war that it needs to do on the ground. But where we in the diaspora can come in is to help wage the war that is being waged in public opinion. That's where we can make inroads. And it's also where our detractors know that there's a weakness. Their goal is to apply pressure in the war of disinformation in the hopes that it will imperil Israel's actual security posture. That is their fundamental goal, and that's where we come in.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the detractors of honest reporting specifically. I know that I'm not sure how much this is on your radar. I would suspect it is, but a professor, I think at UBCO, am I has alleged that honest reporting is fostering hate towards journalists. What are your comments on something like that?
Yeah, so let's go to the definition of the accusation, right? So
Mhm.
being as though we are directing people to read a journalist's work, to critique it, judging the merits of the report itself, and then to send civil communication to a journalist. How does that amount to hate? So that's the kind of like a ad hominem attack that's just not constructive, and quite frankly, it's slanderous, right? Like I think that more than anything, look, nobody in any profession likes even constructive criticism. It's a tough thing for a lot of people to appreciate, but our fundamental goal is to improve journalism. And in the sense that we are trying to, in essence, embrace, to empower, and to educate Canadians to advocate for Israel, if that's hate, what is?
Well, I'm gonna let you take a wild guess where that guy sits ideologically on the Israeli Palestinian conflict.
Right.
Um, we,
It-
we, we
it-
sort of know. Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of and what's interesting is this morning before this, I was a guest on a podcast about anti-racism, and in that discussion, one of the things that even clarified for me during it was since October 7th, with the protests that started October 8th, right? Like, and it's claims of genocide occurred already then before even a single shot was fired from the Israeli side. Um, that in our streets and in the protests, and we heard around the world, the gas the Jews, or the Hitler salutes, or all these things, when they weren't dealt with, created a new line, right? So this is what's acceptable. Well, they did this, nothing happened. So now the new line over what's acceptable moves even further down the line. What we've come up with and seen as a result over the last couple of years, as a lot of those opinions have become mainstream, regardless of how factually incorrect they have become mainstream. And that has resulted in a level of hatred towards Jews, anti-Semitism on the rise. Like, it's actually real world um, damage that happens to me, to you, to Jared, our families, in schools, everywhere. And it's that if we don't hold people to account, this isn't just, journalistic responsibility. This is safety of Canadian citizens at stake here. And that's not hyperbole.
No, it's not. And look, since time immemorial, hate mongers have always tried to move from the margins to the mainstream. We know that, right? We're talking hundreds of years ago. And, give an inch, take a mile. The tolerance of the intolerant is what we are experiencing. Whether it's CBC who are platforming known bigots, real toxic anti-Semites, and presenting them effectively as if they're representative of certain communities, and that they're credible stakeholders and interlocutors. This is the big problem. And for us as a community, we have to forcefully push back against that with every tool at our disposal.
Okay, CBC. Let's get on to CBC for a second here. You guys just produced a huge report on CBC. I have a million questions, but I'll save it for one follow-up, Don. I'm gonna
Yeah,
put
yeah, you
my
got
put my tick there. Is the CBC unique in journalistic malpractice? First of all, they're committing journalistic malpractice. Are they unique in it? And further to that, what are they to be held to a different standard? I want to preface this by letting our listeners know that historically I'm a CBC listener. I like our CBC morning guy. I value it from a Canadian content perspective. I like their perspective on kids going back to school and this issue and that issue. But it is hard to ignore how absolutely toxic they are on ideological issues.
Yeah. You use the right preface to call it journalistic malpractice, because effectively that's really what it is. Most certainly, the CBC has to be held to a different standard in contrast to other private media. Simply put, not only do we have $1 billion with a new cash infusion of an extra $150 million from the public purse, CBC is accountable to Canadians and legally, according to the Broadcasting Act, to a certain standard of journalism and practices that it is clearly not adherent to, constantly flouting and constant one-sided anti-Israel coverage. So yes, absolutely, it should be critiqued differently from a private broadcaster or a private news outlet. But there is an overwhelming narrative imbalance. There's an overwhelming anti-Israel bias. And we try to look at the product of journalism itself and not necessarily who is doing the reporting. The challenge, meaning I wouldn't, I have to assume that the CBC employs several thousands of journalists, right? I would never cast a net far and wide and say that several thousand CBC employees are anti-Israel. What I can do is point out that the overwhelming coverage that they put out is anti-Israel, and it is not a surprise that there are certain journalists who chapter and verse, time and again, put out really jaundiced and anemic coverage that singles Israel out for a program and doesn't give Israel the fair shake. So, Don, whether it's mentioning a Middle East bureau chief from 2 decades ago, and I think I know the individual you're thinking of,
Hmm.
there are some serial offenders, some individuals who have an overwhelming inclination to not judge favorably and to not really abide by the code of ethics that the CBC claims to adhere to.
Okay, so you know, your the report that came out specifically talked about print. Uh, Honest Reporting will often comment about radio, which qualitatively might be worse than print, but I know print was probably a little bit easier for analysis purposes. I'll be interested to know from you if there is a future analysis of radio bias, because certainly we know it's there. Um, in the last 24 hours, there have been two news stories that have come out. I'm sure you're aware of them, Mike. One being that the ombudsman, so CBC has an ombudsman. For those of you who don't know, this is someone that is actually hired in order to try to ensure fairness, absence of bias in reporting. I mean, wow. Talk about someone who should be really busy, but apparently isn't finding a ton of bias in the reporting. But yesterday, the ombudsman had commented about a story in the Liberal Party where those who expressed dissent about a particular approach that the Prime Minister had taken on Israel, CBC had indicated their religion. Those that were opposed to the Prime Minister, two of them were labeled as Jewish. Interestingly, a third who was also Jewish, who didn't dissent, Corinna Gould, her religion was notably absent from the report. It was only important, apparently, to know the religion, the Jewish religion of two that were opposed to the Prime Minister's stance. And I want your comments on that. The second was something today. David Cochrane apologized on air to a member of the Canadian Iranian community for interviewing someone that was in discussing the protests in Iran, someone who was essentially just parroting, the Iranian regime's talking points, and the Iranian community was incredibly upset about that. And David Cochrane came on air and apologized to this Iranian Canadian. We see two instances. One where a community really spoke out and called the CBC to account, and CBC, David Cochrane apologized on air. Another where the ombudsman responded to apparent bias in reporting the religion of two MPs. Is the CBC actually trying? Are they doing anything? Why were those effective? Why did we see some results there? Why, given the number of challenges that we see, the daily instances of bias, what made those two things stand out? Or is it a sign that CBC is doing anything?
Well, I certainly hope it's not an anomaly. That's first and foremost, and sort of to reverse engineer with respect to the on-air apology, which aired last night on Power and Politics, which is effectively a flagship program for the CB.
Hmm.
It's almost unprecedented in what happened.
Hmm.
I actually think it reflects well upon the CBC that they did that, that they atoned for really what you just said, which was they gave a platform and effectively a soapbox to somebody to be a shill for the Iranian regime, uttering their talking points. And in that interview, they even blamed the Mossad for the protests and the deaths that came about. The individual who's interviewed, I think, was from the Iranian Canadian Congress, and you're right to point out that the Iranian community filed complaints en masse, as did our organization. I'd like to believe that it was that public opprobrium, that public scrutiny, that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that had some kind of an effect. I think there's no question that because there was the public scrutiny, it caused CBC some embarrassment and I hope personal reflection. Because it's broadcast, because it's then shared on social media, you can't deny that this is out there. There were a number of very prominent Iranians who complained about what the CBC had did. So was this a one-offer, or is this going to reflect in their future reporting? I hope that David Cochrane realizes, sincerely that his reporting and that his interview was one of those softball lobbing kind of interviews that required, look, if you're going to bring somebody on air, especially with a problematic background of effectively being a shill for the Iranian regime, you have to really level serious questions. He didn't do that. So the contrition is important, and I think it reflects well upon the CBC. Always the challenge, though, is how many people are actually going to see the corrective action versus the original broadcast, which portrayed the regime in a rather flattering light. So that's with respect to what transpired in the past 24 hours. With respect to the Ombudsman report, which was published, I think, 2 or 3 days ago, that you correctly explained. I have a couple thoughts as it relates to the Ombudsman. The first is that my concern is that uh, the role can be somewhat like a window dressing of accountability. That
Mhm.
yes, there is a review, there's a tacit arbitration that is carried out, but there is no power within the ombudsman's office to instruct and to compel any kind of corrective action. So, the ombudsman can give a slap on the wrist to say it was wrong for the CBC in this article that was written by a journalist named John Paul Tasker to identify the number of MPs as being Jewish. It was wrong. They shouldn't have done it. It plays into tropes about dual loyalties for the Jewish community. Interestingly, the article didn't refer to Salma Zahid as being Muslim, which was what was pointed out by the complainant.
Mhm.
So again, that reflects positively upon the CBC, but it exists in obscurity. The just to source this review on the ombudsman's website, it's like almost impossible to find.
Mhm.
So, to your broader question, how did this contrition come about? These two examples concretely show it took complaints. It took people being really not satisfied with the CBC with what the CBC did and effectively saying, not on my watch. I'm going to hold them
Mhm.
accountable. So that actually really reinforces and validates what we do, which is and it also is a really good testament of the power of one, and mobilizing on an en masse kind of an effort.
I guess to kind of follow in Jared's footsteps, I have a two-parter as well, so I'm going to put my chit in. But the first question is: you came up with a report, or sorry, Honest Reporting came up with a report that used empirical evidence, right? This was scientific. This wasn't something that a bias would have recognized in and of itself. This is something that you went through, empirically found that there was bias from within the CBC. Do you find that because honest reporting is known for holding CBC to account, that reports like yours are often dismissed because it's from a biased organization? So it doesn't take into account that it was done empirically under strict journalistic standards in a fact-finding mission, but it came from honest reporting, therefore it's not a serious document. Do you
Well,
find that you have to fight that battle a lot?
Yeah, that is most certainly going to happen, and it's unfortunate. And I'll just tell you, the initial CBC response to the research that HR Canada charitable organization did was to effectively deflect and deny, basically saying, really, there's no bias. What are you talking about? We have an ombudsman. Instead of actually looking at the research, which is an AI instituted study that without any kind of a human tainted bias that shows that there's an overwhelming ratio of imbalance in the CBC's investigations and reporting, which also shows very similar to the example with the interview on Power and Politics with the Iranian shill, that CBC oftentimes will give a platform to anti-Zionist voices in Canada's Jewish community as being
Hmm.
representative and disproportionate. So there's a lot of similarities there. It's unfortunate. It's not surprising that the CBC isn't reading the research. It's about 100 pages long that utilized the services of one of the leading AI research organizations. But that's why it's all the more important to hold truth to power, and may require, I believe very strongly, political intervention for the CBC to actually do its job if they are not going to be willing to actually look at the research themselves. It was actually a couple of months ago that Rachel Thomas at a MP and at a meeting, at a parliamentary committee meeting, I believe it was for the Heritage Committee, had the CBC president, Marie-Andre Bouchard, had was asked a number of questions and asked specifically, you know, what is there an anti-Israel bias at the CBC? And her testimony was absolutely not. Just an immediate rejection without actually doing an investigation. So it's why our organization is saying, look, I don't think CBC can police itself. There is a necessity for there to be not just an arm's length, an independent investigation of the CBC's reporting, because we actually believe that the overwhelming anti-Israel coverage is helping to serve to fan the flames of hatred against Canadian Jews. We
Yeah.
think there's a causal effort, and that's why we hold the CBC to such a high standard. It is also, I believe, the largest creator and disseminator of news in Canada, from radio, print, and broadcast and social media. So the reach is overwhelming.
Hmm.
And that kind of goes into, or can lead us into this next question. And this is, obviously, I won't be the opinion of Honest Reporting. I really want the opinion of Mike Fegelman. I saw a couple of videos over the last couple of years. One of a journalist that was a Middle East correspondent, and he chartered the course of how their reporting changed. So when they received numbers or information from Hamas, they would say, as said by the terror organization Hamas, and then how those journalistic standards changed to just be the Gaza Health Ministry, because otherwise they couldn't get information and they were told not to sort of label them as they are. And he chartered that course in surprise. Then there was another video I saw of a Jewish journalist who worked at The Guardian who started questioning The Guardian's obvious bias and actually received a response that led her to leave The Guardian. And that was, her argument was, I don't understand where this bias comes from. Arabs, Muslim Arabs in Israel actually have more rights and freedoms than any other country. We're not looking at this from a fair perspective. And it was told back to her flat out that Israel, because it is a liberal democracy, is held to a higher standard than any of those other Islamic countries. And so, therefore, the scrutiny against them is fair.
Hmm.
They are, because they can vote in or not vote in, their oppression, quote unquote, is more tragic,
Right.
which logically doesn't make sense. So, what is your opinion, Mike? Why? We know that they are biased. We know that the causal effect is uh, actual criminal activity and hate crimes against Jewish people. Why is the CBC biased against Israel?
I, and this is based on 20 plus years of work and countless meetings with number of CBC journalists. I think there is a combination of an inherent herd mentality that exists within the CBC, where there's a hiring practice that effectively there's a groupthink. There is an ideological affinity for certain issues over the other. And it's not a surprise that the people who work at the CBC, I think a lot of them are very critical of Israel overwhelmingly. And criticism is healthy, but it's disproportionate and it's not balanced. So I think at the core, it comes down to a bit of a culture within the CBC that is traditionally anti-Israel, that is traditionally anti-conservative, and a lot of that is based on either established hiring practices or a sort of a cultural scenario within the CBC that it's not only is it fashionable, but you might get a promotion if you continue your anti-Israel reporting. So I think that it's a two-pronged issue for why it exists more concretely at the CBC versus other media outlets.
Thank you.
Mike, if you can, please summarize the most significant findings that were in the report. So again, this was a sample of CBC print media. Um, what were the big takeaways?
The biggest takeaways were that on top of there being an overwhelming imbalance ratio in the amount of critical stories overwhelmingly against Israel, there was even a headline imbalance where because you could have stories that the CBC publishes that they themselves don't write, maybe they're taken from a wire source, but their editors actually augment and change the headlines, that the manual subjective effort to torque a headline to be critical of Israel, whereas maybe the article itself maybe was more neutral. You could see the intentional kind of slant there. And the other main issue that I mentioned just before was the elevating of anti-Israel voices. And you mentioned just before that radio you suspected was even perhaps worse than digital. I believe that to be true, and that might be a future study we'd like to undertake. And just by way of example, um, it seems like every week we are constantly flagging the CBC for giving a platform to there's just no shortage of anti-Israel voices. And on CBC specific, they have certain programs where on a daily basis, let's say they find one anti-Israel source, that person will be interviewed about a dozen times that day on different CBC programs. And I would almost be open-minded in saying, okay, you want to do that, you're free to interview whoever you want. That's the purview of the CBC. But if you're not going to do the same thing a day or two later and interview a pro-Israel source 12 times, then we have a real problem. And that's at the core of what the CBC is doing. They are constantly saying, look, we're objective, we're neutral. They are constantly asserting that their reporting balances over time without actually substantiating that it is. That is at its core. You'll file a complaint, and the CBC will say you cannot critique this report in isolation. Yes, we interviewed this person, but you didn't see our interview a week before or what maybe 2 months down the road. They never actually show it. They never actually prove that they're procuring balance, and balance has to exist per individual program. You can't say that this CBC radio program balances out a CBC TV program. It has to be done, and I'm not suggesting pure mathematical equivalence, but there has to be a strive for balance. It doesn't even seem to be that there's any kind of an effort to work towards balance. That's the biggest issue. So our voices and our issues are being marginalized and alienated and not given coverage.
There was there was a documentary that I saw called Best of Enemies that highlighted how how ABC News was really a non-functioning, wasn't really a player in the news game. And then in the 68 Democratic convention, they didn't have enough money to broadcast the entire convention. So they just did a 1 hour synopsis with Gore Vidal and oh my God, his name is escaping me right now. A right-wing a pundit of that time, and this was the first crossfire type of show they had, and it chronicles how journalistic integrity moved from being actual people with morals to entertainment. And I think one of the funnier things there was Tucker Carlson was recently sued, or a couple of years ago sued for misinformation, and the judge threw it out because, well, nobody should take Tucker Carlson or anything. He says seriously, so he's not really a journalist. He has an entertainment show. Okay, so where are we right now on the CBC? Is this news or is this entertainment?
I almost think that they relish in the fact that you cannot discern one from the other. And
Right.
the outcome is we have no idea. It's almost impossible to tell at this point, right? Like there's just such a blurring of the lines. I think it's intentional, and I think it has damning consequences.
Mike, the we've talked at length about the CBC, and for good reason. I agree wholeheartedly. They need to be held to a completely different standard. And given how far below the standard they are falling, it's hard to fathom that tax dollars are going there and increasingly going there. If you are a Canadian looking for news, where do you go these days?
That's a great question. By the way, the first thing I do want to say is my organization does not take a position on whether CBC should be funded or defunded. That's for Canadians to determine. It's not for us to get involved in. But as it relates to which news somebody should read, I mean, the very first thing I should say is outside of attending university, the number one source of information is traditional mainstream media and then social media. And for me, my recommendations, just in terms of the issues germane to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Jewish community, again, I strongly encourage media literacy. So in Canada, whether you're reading a product from Post Media, whether it's the Calgary Herald or the National Post, reading the Globe and Mail, Canada's paper of record, reading in Toronto, the largest circulation daily newspaper, the Toronto Star, some of these papers and some of these media outlets, um, ha they show a lot of animus against Israel. They show a lot of bias. But I think it's important that we read it, we confront it, because a lot of people would say, look, we need to divest from problematic media. And I actually think the opposite should be
Mhm.
happening. We need to scrutinize it. We need to put their feet to the fire when it's necessary. The other thing I would say is reading, listening, and watching as much international media, whether it's European coverage in the Middle East, that's necessary. And I would also say, look, I'm not one who necessarily turns an unfavorable eye towards social media. I think there are a lot of good, what I would call citizen journalists out there who are doing a very good job in contrast to a lot of professional journalists who aren't. And by the way, the same is also true, where you have people who are presenting themselves as if they're journalists, but they're actually just activists. So you really have to have that kind of a discerning eye. But more information is better than less. At least that's what I would say. And then do your due diligence, right? Somebody is making a claim, double check, triple check, quadruple, whatever it takes. I mentioned the world of deep fakes and AI. This is a hell of a challenge, to the point where you can get involved in the fact checking process. If you have Twitter, for example, if you have X, you can community note something if you know what that entails.
Mhm.
And then the power of that is incredible, right? So if somebody puts out a statement that's false or misleading, maybe libelous, you community note it. The public, the masses will get to see it. It will go viral. And there's just such a great opportunity, I think, for our community in just getting involved in that because we talk about naturally wanting to reach beyond the choir and convert it. Here you have an opportunity to effectively usurp the platform, community note something or flag it or comment, and then you work the algorithm in your favor. Your views are juxtaposed to somebody who put out some disinformation. That may be from
Mhm.
a professional journalist, or it may be from a radical. By the way, it may be your local member of parliament who's contributing to spreading disinformation. And I think we have that opportunity to rebut it, to quote tweet it, and take them to task.
I remember I went to college in Toronto as well. I lived at Yonge and Eglinton, and where I lived, I could just take the elevator down from my apartment, go right into the subway. And I'll never forget there was a newspaper ads. Like for a newspaper, local paper, and it said, "It's not the news; it's how you tell it." And every time I'd walk by, I just get so anger. I go, no, it's the news. It's the, it's five W's and how. Like that's what I learned in school. When did it change? So I refused to buy newspapers. I would just read the, remember it had the Metro. I hope it still has it because they don't have enough time to lie to me. That's how I kind of felt. Um, but when we talk, I want you to talk about the defund the CBC slogan, because again, if something is reduced to three words, I don't trust it. So let's explore what that means politically, what they're actually vying for, the different parties. When people say defund the CBC, what does it actually mean? What could it look like if it happens? Because the fear that I have is the CBC with its current bias is the evil we know. What would replace it is something that to me uh, makes me uncomfortable because in replacing a national broadcaster, as we've seen in the US, it creates a vacuum that gets filled up by Candace Owens's and Tucker Carlson's and Nick Fuentes's. And, like what so that's the exploration that I'd like to know. Your opinion on whether we should defund the CBC or not is irrelevant. I want to know what it means and what it could look like if it comes to pass, and should it.
Yeah, it's an interesting theoretical in the proposition that it would be defunded. What takes its place?
Right.
There's always the possibility that some of the radicals will take the reins, and then you have a rudderless system. And I think that that's a hell of a challenge. So what's the alternative to that? It's really hard to say. Like, our organization, we just don't take a position on that basis, right? There are arguments for and against the fact that it helps to procure a Canadian national identity. I think there's substance to that, but at what cost? And what happens when the inmates are running the asylum, and
Right.
when some of their reporting and some of the policies that they're putting forward are less about reporting and more about cobbling together a certain type of Canadiana that the powers that be deem important, meaning that there's a certain agenda that they're putting forward. And that agenda traditionally juxtaposes with the Jewish community in the state of Israel. So the subjective element of who is steering the reins at the CBC is rightfully under scrutiny. They do have a board of directors, but I think there is a necessity for more transparency in the process of how journalism is being cultivated at the CBC.
Mike, this podcast is relatively new. Don and I have been recording for a couple months now, and there's been multiple times that we have promoted honest reporting, and on panels that I've been on, I'm often asked by Jews, but more specifically by non-Jews, how can we help? And I direct them to you guys uh, all the time.
Thank you.
Um, because I feel like, yes, for us, a major issue is the coverage on Israel and the implications for the Jewish community here, but also even just, uh, you know, Israel removed from the picture, the way that anti-Semitism can be framed or not framed, covered, not covered, the way that mobs on our street are covered or not covered. Um, that's important to us, but it's an ideological framework that is a checklist. We know that, those who hate Israel um, also have a tremendous amount of disdain for many Western democracies, including our own. Um, and it's been a great unifier for for Jewish and non-Jewish communities. So I want to applaud you on that and tell you how appreciated you are and what an important role. How can, aside from getting on your mailing list, how can Canadians help you? I mean, do you have this massive team of researchers who are going through everything? Do you want people to email you and say, hey, I heard this today. You guys should give this a listen. Beyond media, are there things that you guys want to be flagged on? Tell us, aside from campaigns, aside from emails based on some of your initiatives, are there ways that people can help you guys?
Absolutely. Well, the very first thing I would say is that our team is a lean team of seven. And we work to punch above our weight, but the strength of what we do is exclusively reliant on our 80,000 subscribers who are our eyes and ears, right? Whether you're reading a local publication here, a local radio station or TV program, people will constantly send us emails or on social media will flag problematic reports. And sometimes they don't know necessarily what's actionable about it. And it may not be, but they'll flag it to us and then we'll help to, point out a shortcoming and mobilize them to take action. We need more of that. We need
Mhm.
more people who are active consumers. We can only do so much, right? We have a bandwidth issue just naturally on that basis, and we use a number of different technologies. But and there's just no shortage of problematic reports that we get on the basis of having a large constituency from coast to coast. So our goal in 2026 is to grow to 100,000 subscribers. The more people who we have as eyes and ears, the more people that we can mobilize to take action, the better. And in essence, a bit of a long-term goal is the realization that if we can encourage Canadians and advocates for Israel and the Jewish community to create social media platforms and accounts, that our voice can have a bigger bully pulpit than the traditional media in themselves, that it can rival in, I would almost say we have the power of eclipsing the reach. So we don't need the media to be the go-between, but we need to really be part of that battle for public opinion, right? Like if you
Mhm.
were to poll a dozen of your family and friends and ask them, are you active on social media? Maybe a couple would say yes, but in what way are they? Are they just posting pictures of a recent holiday, or are they actively trying to influence the paradigms that are out there? And
Mhm.
you have a following, you have a constituency, you have followers from work, from your community, you name it. That's where we need to be in just reaching out to people beyond our community, cultivating relationships with different allied communities, and really working in lockstep and tandem to advance our shared interests.
Um, it's amazing. I did want to just go back. The name of that right-wing pundit in that documentary came up. It's William F. Buckley Jr.
Yeah.
But um, Roger Ailes once famously said when he came up with Fox News, "We can't tell people what to think, but we certainly can tell them what to feel." And it seems that honest reporting, it seems that the CBC is sometimes guilty of that, and honest reporting's job is we're not here to tell you what to think or to feel. We're just here to give you the information as unbiased as it could possibly be. And that is a noble work, and it is making inroads. It is important, and so we're appreciative of the work that you do. And we already have some action items. But as we kind of wrap up this schmooze, is there a final message that you would like our listeners to really consider, take home, actions that they can specifically do other than, go to a platform, subscribe to a platform, write your own, get your voice heard? Is there a last message that you'd like to give us?
The biggest message I would like to relay is that we as individuals and members of this community can no longer pass the buck of responsibility and just assume that, let's say, some of our established Jewish organizations will address kind of an issues. We need a sort of an embrace of a grassroots approach, a bottom up and not a top down approach. The realization is, and I hate to say it, we're at war. It is an all hands on deck kind of a situation. And if every person, if your listeners are not actively putting time into their work week to advance interest for the Jewish community, we will suffer. Our detractors are most certainly working hard. They're working double time to advance their interests. We need to step up to the plate. So if you're not doing something, get involved. If it's going to be a media patroller and critique the media, do it. If you're going to volunteer for a local member of parliament, we need you to. If you're going to join a committee in your community to advance our interests, do it. There is no excuses anymore. So my main message to to any of your listeners is we need you to get actively involved. I don't want to present that my organization can do everything. That would be irresponsible. It's a realization that to advance our issues, we need help. We are in an all hands on deck kind of a situation.
Thank you.
Mike, thank you so much. I don't want to just blow smoke and tell you you're great, but you guys really are doing amazing work and have been for a long time. What do we as Jewish Canadians, and what do we as more broadly as Canadians want? We want the news. We don't need ideology. We want the news, and that is what we can and should expect of our media. And you guys are doing a heck of a job trying to create that. So we thank you so much. And for our listeners, again, Jewish, non-Jewish. Honest reporting is really one of the most important things we can follow. Please sign up on their mailing lists, get involved. This is how opinions are created in this country, and this is how laws are created. This is how politicians are mobilized. This is a really important organization. And Mike, thank you so much for taking the time today.
My great pleasure, Don. Thank you very much, Jared. Thank you. Continued
Yeah.
success podcast.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being on the Schmooze.
My pleasure.